James sat silently in the courtroom, his fingers clasped tightly together, as the low murmur of voices echoed around him. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive, in the starkly sterile chamber. The rigid wooden benches, the sharp click of shoes on polished floors, and the sight of the gavel resting ominously at the judge's bench lent the room an intimidating gravity. It was a place where decisions of profound consequence were made, and James's entire world now hung precariously in the balance. He shifted slightly, the coldness of the courtroom seeping into his bones, not just the physical chill but the emotional weight of it all. This wasn't supposed to be his life. There had been a time, not long ago, when things were simpler. It was him, Lisa, and the children, a family bound by love and dreams. But now, he sat here as a man fighting for his kids, while Lisa spun a story that bore little resemblance to the truth. James's mind drifted back to their beginnings, to a time when love had seemed so effortless. He and Lisa had met in college, their connection instant and electric. James, ever the steady and responsible one, had been captivated by Lisa's vivacity. She was carefree, spontaneous, and bursting with an irrepressible zest for life. Their differences felt like the perfect complement, his focus and stability balancing her untamed energy. After graduation, life moved quickly. Their first child arrived soon after, and with it came the sleepless nights, diaper changes, and chaotic schedules. Gone were the carefree days of late-night parties and weekend getaways, replaced instead by the rhythm of parenthood. James embraced it wholeheartedly. Fatherhood brought him a sense of purpose and fulfillment he had never known. He relished being the rock his children could lean on, the steady presence in their lives. At first, Lisa seemed equally invested. She was there during the long nights, sharing the burden of feedings and endless diaper changes. But over time, cracks began to appear in their shared vision of family life. What James saw as a life they were building together, Lisa began to view as a constricting cage. The carefree spontaneity that had once defined her seemed to chafe against the responsibilities of marriage and parenthood. Arguments started cropping up, small, almost trivial at first. They quarreled about parenting philosophies. James believed in structure and discipline, a framework that provided stability, while Lisa leaned toward a more relaxed, go-with-the-flow approach. These disagreements, however, were merely surface-level signs of a deeper divide. Their backgrounds, which had once seemed complementary, now felt worlds apart. James, raised in a close-knit family that valued hard work and accountability, couldn't understand Lisa's upbringing and privilege, where life's challenges seemed effortlessly smoothed away. As the months stretched on, the gap between them widened. Lisa began staying out late, citing work or the need for a night out with friends. At first, James accepted her explanations. But as these nights grew more frequent, her reasons rang increasingly hollow. He often found himself alone at home, handling bedtime routines and waiting for Lisa to return. When she finally did, the scent of alcohol and an expensive perfume lingered in the air. James tried to bridge the growing chasm. He asked her, gently at first, what was wrong. "We're just in different places," Lisa would respond, dismissing his concerns with a wave of her hand. "I need space. It's not like I'm abandoning the kids." But that was exactly what it felt like. Lisa's absence grew more pronounced, her attention more consumed by a world outside their home. Night after night, James stepped into the roles of both mother and father, handling school drop-offs, attending parent-teacher conferences, and managing the myriad small tasks that made their family's life run smoothly. The breaking point came late one night when Lisa didn't return home at all. James sat on the couch, pacing occasionally, the hours dragging by with mounting frustration and unease. When she finally walked through the door the next morning, she appeared unbothered, her expression one of casual indifference. "What are you doing up?" she asked, her tone devoid of guilt. James stared at her, his voice tight with restrained anger. "I'm waiting for you. Lisa, you can't just disappear all night. We have children, our children. They need you here." Lisa sighed, a faint note of irritation in her voice. "James, I needed a break. Can I have that?" "You've got everything under control here anyway. It's not like they're suffering." The casual dismissal of her responsibilities cut him deeply. "This isn't just about you, Lisa. You can't walk away from your family every time you feel overwhelmed. That's not how this works." She rolled her eyes, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "You're so dramatic. The kids are fine, James, and honestly, you're doing an amazing job with them." Her words, intended to deflect, landed like an insult. It was clear to James that whatever connection they had once shared had eroded into something hollow. As Lisa turned away, unconcerned, James felt the weight of their fractured relationship settle on his shoulders. He had been fighting to keep their family intact, but now it was clear he was in this fight alone. That was the moment James knew their lives would never return to what they once were. Whatever bond they had shared had crumbled, leaving behind only a hollow, fragile shell of a relationship. Lisa no longer seemed to want the role of a mother, not in the way James needed her to be. She yearned for the freedom she had enjoyed before the children, before the responsibilities. While James had embraced the reality of their changed lives, Lisa was desperately clinging to a past that no longer existed. In the months that followed, the distance between them grew wider. Lisa spent less time at home, and when she was there, she seemed detached, as though her mind was elsewhere. Meanwhile, James became the steadfast anchor holding the family together. Each morning, he rose early to prepare the children for school, packed their lunches, and drove them to class. After long days at work, he returned to pick them up, help with homework, cook dinner, and tuck them into bed. The weight of it all was immense, but he never allowed himself to falter. These were his children, and he was determined to be everything they needed, even if Lisa wasn't. The breaking point came one evening when Lisa announced, with startling nonchalance, that she needed to step away from parenting for a while. "I just need some time to figure things out," she said, casually tossing clothes into a suitcase. "You've got everything under control, right?" James stared at her, the words sinking like stones in his chest. "You're leaving?" Lisa sighed, her tone sharp with irritation. "It's not like that," she replied. "I just need space. You're fine. The kids are fine. This is just temporary." But James knew better. Deep down, he understood that when Lisa walked out that door, she wasn't coming back, not in any meaningful way. The truth was, she had emotionally left their lives long before she physically packed her bags. James transitioned fully into the role of a single father. He carried the weight of the household, raising his children as Lisa's calls became infrequent and her visits sporadic. Yet, James never complained. His love for his kids was boundless, and if this was the life he had to lead, he would bear it gladly. They were his world, and he resolved to protect them, provide for them, and offer them the stability they deserved. As he sat in the courtroom that day, memories of those challenging months flickered in his mind before fading away. Lisa sat across from him, dressed impeccably, her lawyer whispering in her ear. She had spun a tale of hardship, portraying herself as a struggling single mother valiantly seeking justice, while painting James as the irresponsible, absent father. The absurdity of it all gnawed at him. James glanced down at the stack of documents his attorney, Mia, had prepared. The evidence was irrefutable. Every detail was meticulously documented, proof that the children had lived with him full-time since Lisa left, proof that he had covered their school fees, their extracurricular activities, and their daily needs. It was all there, black and white, an undeniable counter to Lisa's fabrications. When Judge John Diggle finally called for the proceedings to begin, James took a deep breath, steadying himself. This was his moment. He had endured the pain and fought through the struggles. Now, he would fight for his children here, under the scrutiny of the court. Lisa took the stand, radiating an air of confidence that made James's stomach churn. She had always been adept at playing a role, and today was no exception. Her appearance was carefully curated, her hair pinned neatly, her expression soft and maternal. To the untrained eye, she appeared to be the very embodiment of a devoted, struggling mother. The courtroom fell silent as Lisa began to speak. Her voice quivered just enough to evoke sympathy, striking the perfect balance between vulnerability and strength. "I've tried my best," she began, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "I really have, but it's been so hard, Your Honor. Raising these children on my own has been overwhelming. And James, well, he just hasn't been there, not the way he should be." She paused, letting her words hang in the air, ensuring they carried their full weight. James clenched his fists under the table but kept his face impassive. This was Lisa's pattern, crafting herself as the victim while subtly discrediting him. Here, in the formal rigidity of the courtroom, her performance was as calculated as ever. Lisa's attorney stood, pacing deliberately as he addressed the jury. "Miss Smokes, could you share with the court what it's been like managing everything alone, raising your children without support?" Lisa nodded, her voice trembling slightly. It's been exhausting. I've had to handle everything, getting them to school, taking them to doctor's appointments, making sure they're fed, clothed, and cared for. I've done it all, with little to no help from James. The attorney nodded solemnly, as though her words were gospel, before continuing. And during this time, has Mr. Carter provided financial support? Lisa's lips tightened into a thin line as she shook her head. No, he hasn't. I've had to work extra shifts, late nights, just to make sure my children are okay. It's been draining, Your Honor, and it's not fair. I didn't ask to do this alone. James stared straight ahead, his chest tightening with every passing second. His heart pounded like a drum as the weight of the courtroom's gaze bore down on him. Every glance felt like a judgment, every murmur a quiet condemnation. To them, he was already guilty, the absent, irresponsible father Lisa so carefully depicted in her narrative. Lisa's performance was impeccable, a masterclass in manipulation. James could see how the judge's once neutral expression softened as her trembling voice filled the room. He noticed the jury exchanging subtle nods, their sympathy aligning with her words. It was maddening. He wanted to rise, to shout the truth into the silence, but he knew better. It wasn't his turn, not yet. So he remained seated, his jaw clenched, as Lisa continued spinning her web of deceit. The lawyer's tone grew serious, almost somber. Miss Smokes, this must be emotionally exhausting for you. Could you share how this has affected you, carrying this burden all on your own? Lisa let out a carefully measured sigh, her shoulders sagging just enough to make the exhaustion seem real. It's been devastating, she said, her voice trembling. My kids, they miss their dad. They don't understand why he's not there, why he doesn't show up for them. And honestly, I don't have the answers. I can't explain why he doesn't want to be part of their lives. All I can do is try my best to give them everything they need. But it's not enough. They need their father. James's hands curled into fists, his nails digging into his palms as he fought to stay composed. Each word Lisa spoke was like a dagger aimed directly at his heart. He had been there, always there for his children, but none of that mattered now. What mattered was the narrative Lisa was constructing and how effortlessly the courtroom seemed to believe it. Judge John Diggle, who had been listening with great care, leaned forward slightly, his expression softening as he addressed Lisa. It's clear that you faced significant challenges, Miss Smokes. Raising children alone is no small feat, especially without the support of their father. Lisa nodded, her voice cracking just enough to maintain her fragile, struggling facade. I've done everything I can, Your Honor. I just want my kids to have the life they deserve. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath, the sympathy in the air almost suffocating. James could feel it pressing down on him, like an invisible weight. Everyone was on her side, of course. She was the weeping mother, the supposed victim abandoned by a man too selfish to care. And him? He was the quiet shadow, the black man already cast into the role society had long ago written for him, a stereotype, not a person. Lisa's lawyer turned toward James with a subtle sneer, gesturing pointedly. And what about Mr. Carter? Has he made any effort to contribute to his children's lives, financially or otherwise? Lisa's eyes met James's for the first time during the trial. For a fleeting moment, something vulnerable flashed across her face, but it disappeared as quickly as it had come. Turning back to the judge, her voice grew firm. No, she said simply. He hasn't. The words hung heavy in the air, thick with accusation. The courtroom stilled, the tension palpable. James could feel the walls around him tightening, the air becoming harder to breathe. He was being painted as the villain, and it didn't matter that every word she uttered was a lie. What mattered was how convincing she was and how willingly the room seemed to believe her performance. Judge Diggle shifted his attention to James, his expression unreadable but edged with skepticism. Mr. Carter, would you like to respond? James drew in a deep, measured breath. This was his moment, the chance he'd been waiting for. But as he opened his mouth to speak, he couldn't ignore the weight of the stares, the quiet assumptions written on the faces of those around him. He could feel their judgments, their preconceived notions. To them, he was already guilty not just of neglect but of being the man they had expected him to be. His lawyer, Mia, placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. It was a small gesture, but it grounded him enough to steady his resolve. Still, he felt trapped. This trial wasn't just about custody or child support, it was a fight for his identity as a father, as a man. And in that moment, it felt like a fight he was already losing. Judge Diggle gave a small nod, his tone even. We'll hear from Mr. Carter shortly. For now, Miss Smokes, thank you for your testimony. We'll take it into consideration. Lisa stepped down from the stand, her head held high, her expression calm yet victorious. She moved with the confidence of someone who had already won. And maybe she had. James could see it in the way the room seemed to lean toward her, the unspoken agreement that she was the one telling the truth, that she was the one who deserved their compassion. As the judge called for a brief recess, James remained in his seat, staring at the polished wood of the table before him. He didn't move as the courtroom emptied. His mind raced, but one thought stood out above the noise: this isn't over. Rising slowly, his legs heavy with the weight of the moment, James made his way through the near-empty room. He stepped into the hallway, where the cooler air brushed against his face, but it did little to calm his nerves. He spotted Lisa standing by the window, arms crossed, gazing out over the bustling city below. She looked composed, even satisfied, as if this were nothing more than a game she was playing and winning. For a moment, James hesitated. Did he even want to approach her? What could he possibly say to make her see reason? But then he thought of their children, their laughter, their faces full of trust. They were his reason. He couldn't let this continue unchecked. Lisa, he said softly, his voice carrying through the quiet hallway. She turned, her face shifting from mild surprise to a familiar, cold indifference. What do you want, James? James took a deep breath, steadying himself. I need to talk to you. Just for a moment. Lisa exhaled sharply, a faint trace of annoyance flickering across her face. She gestured dismissively for him to speak. What is there to discuss, James? I've already said everything that needed saying in court. James clenched his fists, barely containing his frustration. That's exactly the issue, Lisa. What you said in there, it wasn't the truth. You're lying, and deep down, you know it. This isn't fair to me, to the kids. They deserve better. They deserve to know that both of us care about them. That we can figure this out together, even if we're no longer together. Lisa's eyes narrowed, her head tilting slightly as she feigned innocence. I'm not lying, James. I'm doing what's best for them. They need stability, and let's face it, you're not capable of providing that. James stepped closer, his voice lowering but gaining intensity. Do you really believe that? Or is this just about winning, about punishing me? Because if you keep going down this path, it's not just me you're hurting, it's them. They're going to see the truth. Lisa, they'll grow up and realize what really happened. Do you want them to resent you for turning this into a war when it didn't have to be? For a brief moment, a flicker of doubt appeared in Lisa's eyes. It was fleeting, though, vanishing as quickly as it came. Her lips curved into a cold smile, and she shrugged as if brushing away an inconsequential thought. You're overreacting. I'm doing what needs to be done. While you've enjoyed your freedom, your life without any real responsibilities, I've been left to clean up the mess. This is what you deserve, James. James's heart sank. It wasn't anger or defiance he felt in that moment, but a heavy, crushing disappointment. She wasn't going to listen, wasn't going to change. This was never about the kids. It had always been about control, her control. He had been naive to believe he could reason with her. You don't have to do this, he said quietly, his tone almost pleading. We can work something out, Lisa. We don't have to destroy each other like this. The kids need both of us. Lisa's smirk only deepened, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Maybe they do. But not this way, not with you pretending to be the hero when you're the one who abandoned us. James's voice rose slightly, a rare edge of anger creeping in. I didn't abandon anyone, Lisa. You left. You left the kids with me, night after night, while you were out living your life. I've been there every single day and you know it. Lisa waved him off with a scoff, her tone dismissive. You just don't get it, do you? This isn't about you anymore. It's about what I want, and I want the kids with me. Her words landed like a blow to his chest. James felt the weight of them, heavy and deliberate. She wasn't going to budge. Her mind was set, her heart closed. Turning away, James bit back the words he wanted to say. He couldn't trust himself to speak further without letting his emotions boil over. James walked briskly down the hallway, his vision blurring as frustration and despair threatened to overwhelm him. He needed space, somewhere to breathe, somewhere to think without the oppressive weight of the courtroom bearing down on him. Spotting a restroom, he pushed the door open and stumbled inside. Gripping the edge of the sink, he bowed his head, staring at the faint water stains on the porcelain. His breaths came in shallow, ragged bursts, his heart pounding so violently it felt as though it might break free from his chest. It wasn't fair. None of it. He had done everything he could to be a good father, to do right by his kids. Yet here he was trapped in a web of lies, fighting not just Lisa's manipulations but also the deeply ingrained biases of a system that seemed determined to see him fail. A sob broke free before he could stop it. He bit down hard, trying to regain control, but the tears came anyway, hot and relentless, streaming down his face. The helplessness was suffocating. How was he supposed to fight for his children when every card seemed stacked against him? For a brief moment, he allowed himself to break. His shoulders shook as he leaned over the sink, tears spilling freely. He hadn't asked for this battle. He hadn't wanted to fight against the mother of his children. All he had ever wanted was peace, a life where his kids were happy and loved by both parents. As the minutes ticked by, a memory surfaced, unbidden but welcome. He was a boy again, standing in the warm glow of a sunset with his father. His dad, a man of few words, had always been a steady presence in his life. James could still hear his voice, calm, unwavering. "Son, life isn't always fair. But you fight for what's right no matter how tough it gets. Even if the whole world stands against you." The words echoed in his mind, steadying him, grounding him. His father had faced his own battles, battles just as daunting. He hadn't given up, and neither would James. Wiping his face with the back of his hand, James straightened, his breathing more even now. He glanced at his reflection in the mirror. His eyes were red, his face drawn, but the tears were gone. His hands, though trembling slightly, were now clenched into determined fists. There were only minutes left until the recess ended. James took a deep breath and left the bathroom, walking back toward the courtroom. Each step felt lighter, more purposeful. He could feel the gravity of what lay ahead, but he wasn't afraid anymore. The truth was on his side, and he wouldn't let Lisa's lies define him. As he entered the courtroom, Mia, his lawyer, caught his eye and gave him a firm nod of reassurance. James returned to his seat, his heart steady, his resolve unshaken. The judge re-entered the room, silencing the murmurs as the session resumed. It was his turn now, his moment to speak, to share his truth. For his kids, for their future, James was ready to fight. No matter how difficult the road ahead, he wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. James rose slowly as his name was called, his legs steady beneath him despite the immense weight of the moment. The eyes of the courtroom fixed on him, some filled with skepticism, others with indifference. The tension in the room was palpable, a suffocating presence that had been building since the moment the judge opened the case. But this was his opportunity to speak, to dismantle the carefully constructed narrative that had been weaponized against him. As James approached the witness stand, he carried himself with quiet dignity. Though his emotions churned beneath the surface, he kept them tightly controlled. He couldn't afford to falter, not now. His children's future rested on his ability to remain calm and resolute. Once seated, James adjusted the microphone in front of him and waited, his composure unshaken. Mia, his lawyer and unwavering advocate throughout this ordeal, stepped forward with the measured confidence of someone who knew the truth was firmly on their side. "Mr. Carter," Mia began, her voice steady and clear, "could you share with the court your role in your children's lives since your separation from MS. Smokes?" James leaned slightly into the microphone, his voice calm yet filled with conviction. "I've been their father," he stated simply, the weight of the word resonating in the silent room. "I've been the one taking care of them every single day since Lisa left." The courtroom seemed to shift as murmurs rippled through the audience. A few people exchanged glances, clearly unsettled by the stark contrast between Lisa's earlier claims and James's straightforward assertion. Mia continued, giving James the space to elaborate. "Can you explain what that care has entailed?" James nodded, his voice unwavering. "I'm the one who wakes them up every morning, makes sure they're fed, and gets them ready for school. I drop them off, pick them up, and help with their homework. I've taken them to every doctor's appointment, attended every school meeting, and been there when they're sick, scared. in need of comfort. I've been their sole caregiver emotionally and financially since the day Lisa decided she didn't want to be part of that anymore. A heavy silence followed his words, the kind that seemed to hold its own gravity. Even Judge John Diggle, who had maintained an air of detachment until now, glanced up, his raised brow betraying his surprise at the contrast between James's testimony and Lisa's earlier statements. Mia approached the bench, carrying a stack of documents with deliberate care. "Your Honor," she said, her voice measured but firm, "I'd like to present evidence supporting Mr. Carter's account. These are records from the children's school, showing that Mr. Carter has attended every parent-teacher conference over the last year. Additionally, we have medical records confirming he's taken the children to all of their appointments. Finally, there are affidavits from neighbors and teachers who can testify that the children have been living exclusively with Mr. Carter." Judge Diggle motioned for the bailiff to collect the stack of documents. His expression, which had teetered on skepticism moments before, began to shift as he leafed through the papers. The courtroom was so silent that the faint rustle of turning pages could be heard. With every record he reviewed, the judge's brow furrowed further. It was clear now the image Lisa had painted was beginning to fracture. What had once seemed like an airtight narrative of neglect was unraveling under the weight of undeniable evidence. Judge Diggle, who had perhaps been inclined to believe the worst about James, now found himself grappling with a truth that didn't align with his initial assumptions. The judge finally broke the silence, his voice more measured than before. "Mr. Carter, it seems evident that you've been the primary caregiver for your children. Can you explain why this wasn't made clear earlier in the proceedings?" James met the judge's gaze with quiet resolve. "With all due respect, Your Honor," he began, his tone steady but firm. "I didn't think I needed to prove that I was a father to my own children. I've been there for them every single day, and I thought that would speak for itself. I never wanted it to come to this. But I see now that I underestimated how far Lisa would go to twist the truth." The judge's eyes narrowed slightly, but James pressed on, his voice gaining strength. "I've been there since day one. I've raised these kids, loved them, and sacrificed for them. Just because I'm a man, just because I'm black, doesn't mean I don't care or that I don't step up. I'm not the stereotype Lisa wants me to be. I'm not some absentee father who walked away from his responsibilities. I'm their father, and I've done everything I can to give them the stability and love they deserve." The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted once again. It wasn't just Judge Diggle paying attention now, every set of eyes in the room was fixed on James. Even Lisa's lawyer seemed momentarily disarmed by the quiet but powerful conviction in his words. Sensing the opportunity, Mia stepped forward once more. "Mr. Carter, you've mentioned being the sole financial provider for your children. Could you explain further?" James nodded, his tone unyielding. "Since Lisa left, I've been working 2 jobs. I make sure my kids have everything they need: school supplies, clothes, food, medical care, you name it. Every expense, from tuition to doctor's visits, has been covered by me. I've done it all because that's what they deserve." Mia returned to the table, retrieving another set of documents. "Your Honor," she said, addressing Judge Diggle, "we also have financial records and bank statements that show Mr. Carter has been solely responsible for every expense related to his children's care." Judge Diggle accepted the new stack of evidence, his expression now unreadable. Yet James could see the subtle shift in the judge's demeanor, the realization that the story he had been prepared to accept was no longer holding together. And then, the moment arrived that James knew would shift the tide of the entire case. "Your Honor," Mia began, her voice quieter but weighted with intent. "We have additional evidence that Ms. Smokes has been withdrawing money from the children's college savings account without Mr. Carter's knowledge or consent." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. For the first time since the trial began, Lisa's composed facade faltered. Her face drained of color, and she cast a panicked glance at her attorney, who hastily shuffled through his notes, clearly unprepared for this revelation. Judge John Diggle leaned forward, his piercing gaze now fixed on Lisa. "Is this true, Ms. Smokes?" Lisa stammered, her voice shaky and uneven. I needed the money. It was for the kids." But her feeble explanation only deepened the damage. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, and the judge's expression darkened, his displeasure evident. Meanwhile, James remained seated at the witness stand, his heart pounding not with anger but with a sense of relief. This wasn't just about proving Lisa wrong. It was about exposing the truth, vindicating himself after being unjustly portrayed as the villain, a father who supposedly abandoned his responsibilities. Now, the court was beginning to see what James had always known. He had been the one steadfastly present, the one holding his family together while Lisa had drifted into her own world. Mia spoke again, her voice steady and composed. "Mr. Carter, can you explain how this entire situation has affected you and your relationship with your children?" James took a deep breath, his eyes softening as his thoughts turned to his kids. "It's been difficult," he admitted, his voice tinged with both sorrow and determination. "They're confused. Hurt. They don't understand why their mom isn't around as much, or why things are the way they are. But I've done my best to give them stability. I love them more than anything in this world. All I want is for them to have a good life. I want them to grow up knowing their father was there for them, every step of the way that I fought for them." His voice wavered for a moment, emotion threatening to overwhelm him, but he pressed on. "I'm not doing this for money. I'm not doing this for revenge. I'm doing this because my kids deserve the best. They deserve to know they're loved unconditionally, and that no matter what, they'll always have me in their corner." The judge leaned back in his chair, visibly processing James's heartfelt testimony. His earlier assumptions, the implicit biases that had framed his perspective at the start, were now melting away. The respect in his expression was unmistakable. James had shattered every stereotype, every preconceived notion, with his truth. Judge Diggle sat in silence for a moment, the weight of what had unfolded pressing heavily upon him. He turned his attention to the documents Mia had presented earlier. As he leafed through the evidence, school records, financial statements, sworn affidavits, his furrowed brow and tightened jaw hinted at the depth of his reflection. The judge's transformation was subtle but undeniable. The detached, almost skeptical demeanor he'd maintained throughout the trial gave way to something more complex. Confusion, guilt, perhaps even regret. John Diggle was a seasoned judge, one who had presided over countless cases during his long career. Yet, this one felt different. From the moment James had walked into the courtroom, Diggle had felt the shadow of societal biases influencing his perception of the case. He hadn't been fully conscious of it, but it was there, woven into the fabric of his thinking. James's testimony, paired with the undeniable evidence against Lisa, had dismantled those biases, leaving the judge to confront an uncomfortable truth about himself. As he sat there, reviewing the affidavits and financial records, Diggle felt a knot tighten in his chest. He wasn't just reevaluating James's role as a father, he was questioning his own integrity as a judge. How had he, a man who prided himself on impartiality and fairness, allowed such deeply rooted assumptions to cloud his judgment? His grip on the gavel tightened as the realization settled in. From the outset, he had unconsciously leaned into the narrative Lisa had presented, a vulnerable white mother pitted against a black father who, according to a familiar and damaging stereotype, must have been neglectful. It was a story society had told too many times, and Diggle had fallen into its trap without even realizing it. The judge's hands trembled slightly as he held the documents, a flicker of anger crossing his face. Not at James, not even at Lisa, but at himself for allowing the truth to remain hidden beneath layers of prejudice for so long. Finally, Judge Diggle's voice broke the silence. It was quieter than before, less authoritative but imbued with a newfound humanity. "Mr. Carter," he began, his tone measured but sincere, "I want to thank you for your testimony. It's abundantly clear that you've been a devoted father to your children. Furthermore, it appears much of the information provided by Ms. Smokes has been, at best, misleading and, at worst, deliberately deceitful." James sat back slightly, his shoulders easing for the first time in what felt like years. This wasn't just about winning a legal battle. It was about reclaiming his narrative, about being seen for the father he truly was. Judge John Diggle's words, though delivered with precision, carried an unmistakable weight, a reflection of his own reckoning. He wasn't merely addressing James, he was speaking to the courtroom, and in many ways to himself. Beneath the judge's formal tone was an admission, unspoken but palpable, he had been wrong. Diggle turned his attention toward Lisa Smokes, who had remained disturbingly silent since James's powerful testimony. The confidence that once defined her posture had crumbled, replaced by a pale, almost panicked expression. Her eyes darted nervously around the courtroom, as though searching for an escape from the reality she had constructed. "Ms. Smokes," the judge began, his voice firmer now. "You have made grave accusations against Mr. Carter, claims that, as this court has now seen, were not only false but deliberately deceitful." The courtroom seemed to collectively hold its breath as his words cut through the silence. Lisa shifted uneasily in her seat, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment under the weight of his scrutiny. She opened her mouth, perhaps to defend herself, but quickly closed it again, realizing there was nothing left to say. "Not only have you falsely accused Mr. Carter of neglecting his responsibilities as a father," Diggle continued, his tone sharpening with each word, "but you have also attempted to deceive this court by concealing your own actions, particularly regarding the misuse of your children's financial resources, draining their college fund for personal gain. Without the other parent's knowledge or consent, is not just irresponsible, it is indefensible." Lisa's eyes widened, her carefully maintained mask of composure now shattered. Her attorney fumbled with his notes, his face a mixture of frustration and disbelief. But it was too late. The tide had irrevocably turned, and there was no salvaging the situation she had created for herself. Diggle's gaze never wavered as he addressed Lisa, his voice now as cold as steel. "Ms. Smokes, I must express my profound disappointment. You came before this court presenting yourself as a struggling single mother, and I was inclined to believe you. However, the facts we've uncovered today paint a vastly different picture." The murmurs within the courtroom grew louder. Jurors exchanged wide-eyed glances, and even the typically stoic court officers appeared visibly shaken by the revelations. The narrative Lisa had so meticulously woven was unraveling before their eyes, and there was no stopping its collapse. Lisa, for her part, sat motionless, her expression frozen somewhere between disbelief and fear. For years she had manipulated perceptions, shaping the story to suit her goals. She had painted James as the absent, negligent father while crafting herself into the role of the devoted, selfless mother. But now, her lies lay bare for everyone to see. For a fleeting moment, a look of vulnerability flickered across Lisa's face, perhaps regret. But it vanished almost as quickly as it appeared, replaced by that same detached indifference she had worn since the trial began. She wasn't going to break in front of the crowd. She wouldn't allow them the satisfaction. Judge Diggle exhaled deeply, the gravity of the moment heavy on his shoulders. "This court will not tolerate dishonesty or attempts to manipulate the justice system for personal vendettas," he declared with quiet authority. "Ms. Smokes, your actions today have not only wasted this court's time but, more importantly, have inflicted harm on the very people you claim to care about most, your children." His words echoed through the room with a finality that left no room for rebuttal. Lisa had been unmasked, her carefully constructed facade demolished, and the courtroom's sympathies now lay squarely with James. As the tension in the room began to subside, James leaned back in his chair. For the first time in what felt like years, the weight pressing down on his shoulders began to lift. He had fought for the truth, and the truth had prevailed. More than anything, he had shown the world and his children that he was the father they could always rely on, despite everything. The judge wasn't the only one forced to confront his biases that day. The entire courtroom had been compelled to reevaluate their assumptions, to see James not as the man society had pigeonholed him to be, but as the loving, dedicated father he had always been. Lisa, however, was left to grapple with the consequences of her own choices. The image she had so meticulously curated was in ruins, and the courtroom's sympathies had shifted entirely away from her. Whatever her motivations had been, they no longer mattered. What mattered now was the truth, and the truth had finally been exposed. As the judge prepared to adjourn, his final words reverberated through the courtroom. "This court will take a recess before delivering its final ruling. Let it be known, however, that we do not condone falsehoods in pursuit of personal vendettas." The gavel struck, signaling the session's end. James closed his eyes briefly, drawing a deep breath. The most grueling part was over, and the truth was finally in the open. He had won not just the case, but the right to be seen for who he truly was: a father, a protector, and a hero in his children's eyes. James glanced across the room at Lisa, still seated, her shoulders slumped, her face drained of color. She didn't meet his gaze. For the first time, he felt a flicker of pity for her. He had expected to feel triumphant, to savor the victory of exposing her lies. But as he watched her now, sitting in the wreckage of her own making, James realized he didn't need to revel in her downfall. The true victory lay in what he had gained the chance to move forward, free from the shadows of her deceit, and to continue being the father his children needed. The victory wasn't about Lisa Smokes. It was about James Carter's children and the life he had built for them. With the court adjourned, James rose from his seat, shaking hands with his attorney, Mia, and exchanging quiet words of gratitude. Mia had done more than present legal arguments. She had championed the truth in a fight that cut to the heart of deeply ingrained societal biases. James had emerged from it all, not just unscathed but triumphant. He thanked Mia sincerely but felt an undeniable pull to leave. The people who mattered most, his children, were waiting for him. As James stepped out of the courthouse, the cool breeze of the outside world enveloped him, carrying away the suffocating tension of the past weeks. For the first time in months, he took a deep, unburdened breath. The fight was over. Finally, he could return to what mattered most, being a father. His stride was lighter as he imagined the joy on his children's faces when he walked through the door. This wasn't simply about winning a custody battle. It was about defying the stereotypes that had followed him from the moment he became a father, perhaps even longer. Society had tried to relegate him to the shadows. Another absentee black father in a world eager to believe that narrative. But James had proven them wrong. Later that afternoon, James arrived home. As he opened the door, the sound of laughter and the hurried patter of small feet met him like a warm embrace. His children raced toward him, their faces beaming with love and excitement. "Daddy," they squealed, their voices filled with pure joy as they wrapped their arms around him. James crouched down, hugging them tightly, his heart swelling with gratitude. The warmth of their little bodies grounded him in a way nothing else could. He closed his eyes, taking in the moment. This was his family, his life, the anchor that had kept him steady through the grueling days in court. Nothing else mattered, not the courtroom, not the lies, not the biases that had sought to diminish him. Just his kids, who had always known the truth about their father, no matter what the world tried to say. Every so often, James's thoughts drifted back to Lisa. He could have let anger take root, could have let bitterness grow. She had lied, attempted to tear him down, and used their children as tools in a battle he had never wanted to fight. But as he watched his kids chase each other around the room, their laughter filling the air, James realized there was no space in his heart for anger or hate. His love for his children eclipsed everything else. Lisa's future, uncertain as it was no longer his concern. He trusted that the consequences of her actions, both legal and personal, would find her. That was her burden to carry, not his. Maybe one day she would see the harm she had caused not just to James but to their children. Maybe she would feel the weight of her choices and seek redemption. But James wasn't waiting for that day. He had done his part. He had fought his battle and won. Now, it was time to focus on what truly mattered, being the best father he could be. That evening, after tucking his children into bed, James sat on the porch, staring out at the quiet, moonlit street. The stars above twinkled faintly, mirroring the sense of calm that had finally settled within him. The peace of the night was a perfect reflection of the peace he felt inside. James's mind wandered through the events of the past weeks, the courtroom, the lies, the prejudices he had faced. The journey had been grueling, but it had also been transformative. This victory wasn't simply about custody or proving he was a good father. It was about confronting a system designed to see him fail and emerging stronger. He thought back to the moments when he had felt like giving up, the nights when the weight of it all had felt unbearable. But he hadn't. He had fought, not for himself but for his children. And in the end, that was what had made the difference. The cool night breeze brushed against his face, and James smiled softly. He hadn't just won in court, he had won in life. He had shown his children, himself, and the world that he was more than the stereotypes society had tried to impose on him. He was a father, a steadfast, resilient father who had never stopped fighting for the people he loved most. That, above all, was what mattered. As for Lisa, her world had crumbled beneath her. The carefully constructed lies she had woven with such precision were now exposed. The story she had spun, that of a struggling, selfless mother abandoned by a neglectful father, had been revealed for what it truly was, a fabrication. The humiliation burned hot on Lisa's cheeks as she sat alone in the aftermath. She had walked into that courtroom brimming with confidence, believing that her privilege, her ability to manipulate perceptions, and her understanding of societal biases would shield her. She had believed no one would question the narrative she offered, that of a white woman abandoned by her black children's father. But it hadn't worked. The lies she had so painstakingly crafted had collapsed, and now she was left to face the wreckage. Lisa had always believed she could control the narrative. James, she thought, had been an easy target. Society had primed itself to believe in struggling mothers doing it all alone. But she hadn't anticipated James's resilience, his unwavering determination to fight for his children. Now she was left to confront the truth, stripped of the illusion she had so carefully curated. The fallout was hers alone to endure, and the world she had manipulated so skillfully now turned its gaze upon her not with sympathy, but with judgment. The bitterness within Lisa Smokes swelled, constricting her thoughts and emotions like an iron vice. How had her life unraveled to this point? How had she once the confident, magnetic Lisa who could charm her way out of any corner fallen so far? Her mind wandered back to the beginning, to her relationship with James Carter. She recalled how effortless it had been to manipulate him, to diminish his confidence, to make him believe that he was the problem. Lisa had always been the one pulling the strings, orchestrating events to suit her needs. But now it was her turn to dangle precariously at the edge of disaster, caught in a web of her own making. She had aimed to destroy James, to paint him as the villain. But in doing so, she had ruined herself. Her thoughts spiraled into a vortex of anger, humiliation, and a reluctant whisper of regret. Not regret for the lies she had told or the damage she had inflicted. Those feelings were buried too deep beneath her pride. Instead, she regretted being outmaneuvered. How had she allowed herself to lose control? How had James, of all people, come out ahead in this battle? Lisa clenched her teeth, her hands trembling as she wandered aimlessly down the crowded street. She needed a plan, a way to salvage the last fragments of her dignity. But every time she tried to envision a path forward, she collided with the harsh reality she had crafted. The bridges she had burned were beyond repair. The court's judgment hung over her, and the financial consequences of her actions shadowed her every step. Even her remaining personal relationships were frayed to the point of breaking. For a fleeting moment, an image of her children's faces broke through her bitterness. Their innocent eyes, their trusting smiles, they had once been her anchor. But now even they were slipping away. A sharp pang of guilt pierced through the haze, but it vanished almost as quickly as it appeared, replaced by her simmering resentment toward James. In her mind, it was his fault. He had refused to stay in the background, to accept her narrative. If he had just played his role as the silent, absent father, everything would have unfolded as she intended. But no, he had fought back. He had challenged her lies, forced the world to see the truth, and worst of all, he had won. The resentment festered, coiling into a dark knot deep within her chest. Lisa couldn't relinquish her anger, couldn't confront the reality that she had orchestrated her own collapse. The anger, the bitterness, they clung to her like a second skin, suffocating yet familiar. The days that followed blurred together a relentless cycle of tense legal consultations, strained phone calls, and sleepless nights. Lisa attempted to piece together the remnants of her shattered life, but every effort only underscored her failure. Friends who had once offered sympathy now avoided her, unsure of what to say or how to approach her. The court's order to repay the misappropriated funds from her children's college savings account loomed large. With her finances in disarray, she scrambled to address the consequences of her choices, but the damage was too great to undo. Her relationship with her children, once the foundation of her identity, had become unrecognizable. Visits were stilted, heavy with unspoken tension. The children, perceptive beyond their years, sensed the cracks in her facade. They no longer looked to her for comfort or stability. Instead, they turned to James, the parent who had been their constant, their anchor. The realization stung more than Lisa cared to admit. She had always believed she would emerge as the hero in her children's eyes, the parent they would choose without hesitation. But now, when they looked at her, their expressions were clouded with confusion, distance, and, at times, a faint shadow of disappointment. The bitterness continued to consume her, yet it left her hollow, a shell of the person she had once been. Lisa was trapped in the wreckage of her own making, paralyzed between the desire to move forward and the refusal to let go of her anger. She could have chosen to change, to acknowledge her mistakes, to rebuild the bridges she had burned. But that wasn't who Lisa was. She couldn't bear to admit defeat, to face the reality that she had been wrong. Her future was a blank canvas, not with promise but with uncertainty. The world had moved on, and so had James. Her children were finding happiness and stability without her. Control, something she had once wielded so confidently, was now a distant memory. Sitting alone in her apartment, the walls closing in around her, Lisa stared vacantly into the silence. The vibrant, confident woman she once was had been replaced by someone she barely recognized. And in that stillness, a truth she had fought to avoid finally took hold. She had destroyed everything she had ever cared about. And she had no one to blame but herself. Thank you for watching this emotional journey of truth, resilience, and redemption. This story wasn't just about a courtroom battle, it was about the unwavering determination of a father fighting to protect his children and the harsh consequences of deceit. James's courage to confront false narratives, endure judgment, and stand firm for his family teaches us the power of love, perseverance, and doing what's right, even when the odds are against us. This story also reveals the complexity of human emotions, how bitterness, regret, and poor choices can lead us down paths of self-destruction. Lisa's downfall serves as a powerful reminder that actions driven by selfish motives and dishonesty ultimately unravel, leaving lasting impacts on those we care about most. It's a story that resonates with anyone who has faced challenges, fought for justice, or been forced to confront their own mistakes. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more heartfelt stories that inspire, uplift, and connect us. Sharing stories like this helps spark meaningful conversations, so don't forget to share this video with your friends and loved ones. We want to hear from you. How did this story make you feel? Did you relate to James's strength, or perhaps see a cautionary tale in Lisa's choices? Leave your thoughts and reflections in the comments below. We love hearing your perspectives and how these stories resonate with you. Together, we can build a community where stories of triumph, vulnerability, and growth remind us of the beauty and complexity of the human experience. Thank you for being part of this journey.